Hello, my name is Beverly Mills.
And my name is Elaine Buck.
And we are co-authors of the book, If These Stones Could Talk. Today, we're standing at the first site for our webinar series, and it begins here at McConkey's Ferry House, which is over to our right. This is where George Washington crossed the Delaware on December 25th. On this webinar, we discussed the essential role of the Marbleheaders, which was an African-American contingent from Massachusetts. Now, they crossed the Delaware with Washington, and they played a very pivotal role in the outcome of the Battle of Trenton. What we didn't realize when we did our research for the book is that there were African-American men who fought during the American Revolution. Why was this not taught in our history books? Why was this not in our students' history books? So this has emboldened us to find out more information about the Marbleheaders. For example, many Americans know the story of George Washington winning the Battle of Trenton, and most know about him crossing the Delaware on the Christmas night. What very few people seem to know is that the crossing, and consequently the victory, was made possible by a unique mixture of black and white men called the Marbleheaders, sailors from Marblehead, Massachusetts. Part of George Washington's foot contingent, the Marbleheaders, started out with Colonel John Glover in the 14th Continental Line, who fought during the Battle of Trenton, and they captured several Hessian soldiers. At the time, Washington was not interested in enlisting soldiers of color. Colonel Glover, a Marblehead native and ship owner, however, was very familiar enough with working with black sailors, such that he respected both their physical and mental abilities. When asked by Washington if his men would be able to manage this treacherous crossing of the Delaware, Glover immediately answered in the affirmative. The Marbleheaders not only were responsible for transporting soldiers, artillery, and very frightened horses across the river on the 40 Durham boats, but they had to do so on a bitterly cold night, a cold, moonless night, through a half-frozen river. After landing on the other side of the river, the men still had the task of trekking 9 miles to Trenton, where they immediately engaged in battle. It was a feat that showed the Continental Army the ability and determination. No race. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in our reenactors to explain some more about the Marbleheaders and their very, very pivotal role in how Washington succeeded in crossing the Delaware.
Fix your bayonets. Shoulder your arms. Charge your bayonets. Huzzah! Charge! Yeah!
Hi, I'm Leon Brooks. I'm with the 2nd Company of Glover's Marblehead Regiment, otherwise known as the 14th Continental, a re-enactor. As you heard, Marbleheaders historically came from Marblehead, Massachusetts. They were a highly skilled, amphibious fighting force, able to fight both on land and on sea. Washington had tasked Glover to organize, outfit, and crew the first naval ships of the Continental Army and Navy. You will see among these men African Americans. This would reflect the type of industry that the maritime industry was, which included African Americans who had an opportunity to have gainful employment on ships in the Navy and the merchant fleets of the time because of the constant need for manpower, which ships were always short of. Washington trusted these men and their maritime skills to establish the First Initial Navy. When the British evacuated from Boston, there was no more ships for them to attack, no more supplies to take, or arms to capture. So Washington summoned Glover and his Marbleheaders to New York because he expected the British to attack New York next. And they did. Washington suffered huge losses and defeat. Glover's Marblehead Regiment saved Washington's army from capture. As Washington's army retreated to safety in Pennsylvania, the Marbleheaders confiscated and destroyed any boats so the British wouldn't be able to pursue the Continental Army into Pennsylvania. Washington is with his troops, camped, low on supplies, morale is shrinking, and the troops' terms of enlistment are starting to expire. Washington comes up with a plan to attack the garrison in Trenton and resupply his army and uplift his troops and continue to fight for independence. My shipmate, Algernon, will tell you more about the Battle of Trenton itself.
Ahoy. My name is Algernon Ward. It's my honor to reenact some of the 12 to 24 African American sailors who served in the Marblehead Regiment. Remember that the Battle of Trenton was in fact a battle. It was a desperate battle. In fact, Washington's army was in danger of dissolving if this last-ditch Hail Mary effort to surprise the Hessians at Trenton hadn't happened. So in the middle of a nor'easter, over 6,000 men crossed this river, choked with ice in the middle of a nor'easter. It was a very, very foggy night, and snow was falling, and it was extremely cold. In fact, they started suffering casualties, not from battle, but from the inclement weather. They had to march 9 miles in the dark, in a storm, and go into the city of Trenton. Glover's Marbleheaders, after having crossed the river, handling the boats, had to go down 9 miles into Trenton with General Sullivan's column, whose job was to contain any attack coming from the south as Washington attacked the city of Trenton. Glover's Marbleheaders were able to do such a thing. But a lot of people don't know that there were supposed to be 3 crossings that night, but 2 of them failed, and this was the only one to actually make it across the river and to end up in Trenton. The fighting was pitched in Trenton. Because of the storm, the sentries that were supposed to signal the approach of any enemy were not able to see the various columns of Washington's army approaching the city. In fact, the signal cannon almost ran into the head of Sullivan's column, but because of the storm, they turned around. Washington's column was hot on their heels. When they reached what is called 5 Points in Trenton, Alexander Hamilton set up his cannons and opened fire on the old barracks in Trenton on King and Queen Streets. Having been caught off guard and overwhelmed by the numbers, the Hessians began to fall back. Colonel Rahl, who had been out that night before, was a bit slow in reacting, but by that time the American army was upon him. They pushed the British and the Hessians into a field of apple orchard, and on 3 sides they were surrounded, and then finally the Marbleheaders closed the trap on 900 Hessian soldiers. This is the most soldiers that were captured in the war to that time. And the Hessians, being mercenaries, were the finest soldiers in the British Army. So these African Americans who were scattered throughout the American Army in different regiments and concentrated in the Marbleheaders participated in those 10 crucial days that changed the history of the United States. Some would say America started here.
So the research that we did for our If These Stones Could Talk book was done at the David Library, which is right down the road from our destination that we're at right now. It's the Library of the American Revolution, and they currently have moved into Philadelphia. So if you have any research you would like to do, you have to go to Philadelphia to do it at the David Library of the American Revolution. And I'm just going to tell you a couple of the names that we found that were at the crossing. And some of their names were Dick Negro, Black Prime, Negro Sambo, Negro Titus, Pompey Black. These are just a few of the names that we found that crossed the Delaware on December 25th with George Washington and his troops. I don't know about you, but I did not know this in the history books when we were in high school, which for me would be back in 1970. So this is some information that we have gathered together in our If These Stones Could Talk book, and I hope that you will research on your own and find out information that we really do not have available to us in our history books.
Hit, hit, huzzah! Hit, hit, huzzah! Hit, hit, huzzah!
Welcome to the Pennington African Cemetery here in Pennington, New Jersey. I'm Angela Witcher, a member of the Board of Trustees, and our trustee board is actually responsible for acting as stewards of the cemetery that you see here. We have many notable people interred here in Pennington. The cemetery was deeded in 1863, and it was very active for about 100 years afterwards. Some of the most famous people buried in the cemetery are Civil War veterans. We have probably one of the largest number of Civil War veterans from the United States Colored Troop in the area, buried in one place. I'd like to tell you about a few of them. William Boyer, Philip Center, both of them served in the same regiment. Charles Jennings was actually the last surviving Civil War veteran in Pennington who died in 1928. He is also buried here. Joseph Sarubi, his son Archibald Sarubi, was a very important member of the Pennington community. He also is buried here and is a veteran of the Spanish-American War. The families of the Jennings, the Sarubis, the Williamsons, all these families are still very active in supporting this cemetery. There are many others, though, as we continue our research and our outreach to get more information about them and more information out to the public. A little bit of word about the historic preservation efforts that we've done here at the cemetery. It is not without a tremendous amount of effort of dedicated volunteers over the past 150 years. We have also been very active in partnerships with different groups in terms of the Boy Scouts in America, for the flag, for the sign that you see out there, also partnering with schools for educational opportunities and volunteer opportunities for students, and of course applications with grants, and also working with the Borough of Pennington as well. So this is a wonderful place. I hope that as you take a look, you see the peace and beauty that's in front of you. It's a very good place to visit for reflection, for appreciation of history, for a moment to step back, and to partnership and really work with other people on very positive endeavors. We hope that you visit the cemetery soon. Thank you.
Howdy. My name is William H. Boyd. I was born yonder in Ewingville in 1839. I grew up around here working on the farms during the daytime. At night, somebody I won't name taught me how to read. And when I was 18 years old, I met my dear wife, Frances. Most folks around here call her Fanny. Yeah, so I grew up here in Pennington. In about 1860, Rebs started laying siege to Fort Sumter. Said they was hating Lincoln because he was an abolitionist. Said they was gonna break up the country and start a new one. Said they hated Lincoln. A lot of white fellas around here said they was gonna join up the army, save the Union, keep it whole. I wanted to join up too, but they said it was a white man's war. Now, quiet as it's kept, some of the folks around here hid runaways in their homes, fed them, helped them go north. Now, you didn't hear it from me, but some of the churches around here hid runaways too. Some people knew about it, but they kept their mouths shut. Well, after the war started, them young white boys went on off to fight in the army. About 1861, some preachers started coming to the Bethel church, preaching about the end of slavery, how this war was going to put it down once and for all. Told how Mr. Frederick Douglass was leading a delegation to Washington, D.C. Said he was going to plead with Mr. Lincoln to let us colored men throw in with the Union as fighting men. Then lo and behold, 1863, January 1st, they declared emancipation. Boy, we laughed and danced all night long. And a bunch of us said we was going to join up soon as we could. Then sure enough, in May, Lincoln announced Executive Order number 143, which said they was going to take colored men into the Army. Well, we were so happy about that we was finally going to get to join up, but Fanny didn't seem to like it so much. So I told her I would take care of myself, and she said she'd pray for me to come back. So right after Christmas, a few of us headed up north. And on December the 28th, I joined the 29th Regiment, Connecticut Colored Volunteers. So after our training up there in New Haven, none other than Frederick Douglass himself came to speak to us. I was never so thrilled to see such a famous man. And I remember what he said to this day. He said, once you got an eagle on your hat, an eagle on your belt, and a United States weapon on your shoulder, there's no power of darkness can keep you from your citizenship. And he said, and not for yourselves alone are you being mustered. He said that you are the pioneers, that upon you rests the destiny of some 4 million of the colored race here in America. If you rise and flourish, then we rise and flourish too. And if we get our freedom and citizenship, they too shall share in our citizenship. After that, I was cocksure that what we was doing was right. So after our training, they put us on a boat called the USS Warrior. Sent us down to Annapolis, where we was given our new Springfield rifles. And we went from there down to Hilton Head and Beaufort, and then down to the Bermuda Hundred. And that's when we got to our first firefight. The boys was cool as ice water. And from there, we was ordered down to Deep Bottom, where we went on an attack with the whole 13th Division. That's 10,000 colored men. And we was in the trenches out in front of Petersburg, and we were there when they blew up the mine, made a crater bigger than you've seen in your whole life. The slaughter there was horrible. Then they ordered us going back down to Deep Bottom, where we went on the attack at Fort Fisher and Fort Harrison. We tried to get in, but they stopped us. And then the next day, they attacked us. We stopped them. Then we was ordered back up the New Market Heights, and we was at the bloody Battle of Chaffin's Farm. You know that 18 colored men won Medals of Honor that day for bravery. Then they sent us up to New Market and Darbytown roads. The fighting got so hot there, when we reached the Kell House, we lost another 12 men, got 68 of them wounded. And then at Malvern Hill, one of our sergeants, Mr. A.H. Newton, he said he was standing there and he looked out and a cannonball was coming through the smoke straight at him. Looked like it had his name on it. So he said a prayer right quick. He said, Lord, you told me that if 1,000 fall, 9 would come to me. And the cannonball hit the ground 3 feet in front of him and flew right up over his head. He said, Lord, you kept your promise that day. From that, we went back up to Fort Harrison. And then on April the 2nd, we heard all these explosions from the Red gunboats on the river. And then deserters started coming into our line. So at that, we went and attacked the fort. But when we got in, we found out the rebels had already abandoned the fort. And they was retreating back towards Richmond with us in hot pursuit. We could see the flames of Richmond burning in the night. So in the morning, we sent 2 companies forward Company C and Company G, and they were some of the first infantry troops into the Confederate capital, Richmond. Well, after that, on April the 9th, we got word that Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. The war was over, thank God. From there, they sent us up to City Point. They had us guarding about 20,000 Red prisoners. And then from there, they put us in the 25th Corps. They sent us all down to Texas. They sent us to Brazos de Santiago, and we marched from there on up to Brownsville. And when we got there, we found out the slaves didn't know they had been freed. So General Granger had issued an order number 3, freeing all the remaining slaves in Texas. Well, they were so happy. They had a great big celebration. They danced and partied. They said, what day was that on? He said, June 19th. They said, Juneteenth. And they called it Juneteenth ever since. We stayed there a while, and then they sent us back up to New Orleans, and then on up to New York, then finally back on up to Connecticut. So on November the 25th, 1866, they mustered us out and paid us our money. I came on back to Pennington, and me and Fanny had 3 children, 2 boys and a little girl. I started working hereabouts, doing some labor, worked as a waiter. But the job I loved the most was directing the choir at the Bethel AME Church and teaching the kids in the colored school. But after a while, they made me headmaster. And I spent many a satisfying years teaching little colored kids how to read and write and grow up to be fine citizens of Pennington. Well, most of them anyway. Then after a while, they sent me out to pasture. And I spent my days minding my grandchildren, tending my garden, and singing at the church. And I used to go down to Grand Army of the Republic Post, number 56, around there in Trenton, where I saw my other fellow veterans. We told each other our stories. 1900, I took to my sick bed, and on July the 8th, 1901, I had a stroke, and the Lord called me home. My families and friends, they had a great big funeral for me. They buried me in the Pennington African Cemetery. Full military honors. If you ever come by here, you can stop by and see me. I promise I won't get up and scare you.
Present on. Shoulder up.
I'm standing in front of Bethel AME Church in Pennington, New Jersey. Bethel AME is one of the earliest formed churches in this region. Bethel was formed in 1816, and this building was actually built prior to the Civil War in 1847. And it was the place of worship for returning veterans from the United States Colored Troops who came back to be with their families, and for also William Boyer, who we talked about in our cemetery, which was down the road a little bit at the Pennington African Cemetery, who came back to be the superintendent of the school and taught Black children to read and write. This church was also the worship place for many of the African Americans who lived in these homes that are right up and down the street here. This was a thriving Black community. It was where many of the trustees of the church lived, and I am actually a descendant and one of the trustees that made it possible for this church to be in existence.